Leadville, Colorado territory, the 3rd of November, 1887. The sky that morning was a lyre, pale and almost gentle, the kind of autumn sky that whispered of one more mild week, one more forgiving night. But the mud in the streets had already frozen into sharp ridges by dawn, and the water troughs wore a skin of ice that did not melt by noon. For Brittany Carstensen, the sky's lie was the least of the cruelties visited upon her that day. The notice had been nailed to the door of the assay office at 7 in the morning before the town was fully awake. Britta found it when she arrived for work, her breath a white ghost in the still air, her fingers already stiff around the handle of the leather satchel that held her husband's mineral charts. The paper was thick, official, stamped with the seal of the Consolidated Mining Cooperative. It bore 2 sentences. Mrs. Carstensen's position as assistant assayer is hereby terminated effective immediately. All cooperative housing must be vacated by sundown November 5th. 2 days. They had given her 2 days. Her husband, Eric, had been the cooperative's head assayer for 6 years, a man who could read or samples the way a priest reads scripture, with reverence and absolute certainty. He had died in September. Not in the mines, but in the assay office itself, slumped over his work table with a pencil still in his hand. His heart had simply stopped. The doctor said it was not uncommon for men who worked with lead and arsenic residues. Eric had been 34 years old. For 7 weeks after his death, Britta had continued his work. She had learned assaying beside him, not as a student, but as a partner, mixing reagents, calibrating the beam scale, recording results in the ledger with the same meticulous hand Eric had taught her. The miners brought their samples to the window, and she tested them, and the results were accurate, and the work was done. No one complained. No one praised her either. Then Alderman Croft came to town. Croft was the cooperative's district manager, a man who traveled between mining camps with a leather valise and a set of rules he applied like a tourniquet. He was not a large man, but he had a way of filling a room with his presence, with the particular density of a person who has never once questioned his own authority. He wore a watch chain with no watch on it, a detail Britta noticed because Eric had once told her that a man who wears a chain without a watch is performing the idea of importance rather than possessing it. Croft had stood in the assay office that afternoon, running his finger along the edge of the work table, examining it for dust. He found none. He looked at the ledger. The entries were flawless. "You do competent work, Mrs. Carstensen," he said, and the word competent landed like a coin tossed to a beggar. "But the cooperative's charter is clear. Licensed assayers must hold certification from the territorial board. Your husband held that certification. You do not. I have applied for examination," Britta said. "The next sitting is in Denver in March." Croft closed the ledger. "March is 5 months away. I cannot have an uncertified person operating this office for 5 months. There are liabilities, there are standards." He paused, and something flickered across his face, something that might have been discomfort. He adjusted his empty watch chain. "I have a new man arriving from Central City on the 6th. He will need the housing. I have nowhere to go, Mr. Thayer." "Croft, there is a boarding house on Spruce Street. Mrs. Calloway's. She is, I am told, reasonable with her rates." What Croft did not say, what he perhaps did not know, was that Mrs. Calloway's boarding house did not accept women without male escorts. What he also did not say was that Britain's savings amounted to $11.40, enough for perhaps 3 weeks of board even if Calloway would take her. After that, nothing. The nearest relatives were in Minnesota, and the fare east was $14 she did not have. Britta was an outsider twice over in Leadville. She was a widow in a camp that valued women only as appendages to working men. And she was Danish, the daughter of a salt miner from Jutland, a woman who spoke English with a cadence that softened her consonants and lengthened her vowels in ways that made men dismiss her words before they had finished hearing them. Her father, Peter Carstensen, had spent 30 years in the salt mines beneath Mariager Fjord, and before that his father, and before that his father's father. They were men who understood the earth, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be listened to. The town's sympathy for her was genuine but shallow, like a puddle on limestone. It looked like water, but it would not sustain you. The women brought bread the week Eric died. The miners removed their hats when she passed. But when the notice went up, the bread stopped and the hats stayed on. Pity was chased away by the cold arithmetic of a mining camp in November. Every family was calculating its own odds against the coming winter. There was nothing left over for a foreign widow with no claim and no kin. On the morning of November 5th, Britta stood on the frozen street beside her belongings. A trunk of clothes, Eric's toolbox heavy with the precision instruments of his trade, a wooden crate of books, half of them in Danish, the other half in English, and a canvas-wrapped bundle that contained the thing she valued above all else, her father's journal. Peter Carstensen had kept that journal for 30 years underground. It was written in a cramped, precise hand in Danish with diagrams that looked like the work of an engineer crossed with an artist. It detailed everything he knew about salt, about rock, about the behavior of air and water and heat deep beneath the surface of the earth. It was a document of old-world knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations of men who had lived and worked inside the body of the earth itself. Eric had read it. He had translated portions of it for Britta when they were courting, sitting beside the stove in her parents' kitchen in Minnesota, his finger tracing the diagrams. "Your father understands something that these American miners do not," Eric had said, his voice low with admiration. "He knows that the earth is not cold. The surface is cold, the air is cold, but the earth, 20 feet down, is the same temperature in January as it is in July. The earth remembers summer. The earth remembers summer." Britta held that phrase in her mind as she stood on the street, watching the last of the autumn lights slide off the peaks of the Mosquito Range. She had no plan. She had no shelter. She had $11 and a dead man's journal. She also had a memory. 3 weeks earlier, while walking the trail to the creek where she gathered water, she had passed the old McCready claim. It was an abandoned silver mine, one of dozens that pocked the hillsides around Leadville, a horizontal shaft driven into a slope of decomposed granite and then abandoned when the vein pinched out. The entrance had partially collapsed, choked with rubble and brush, the timbers of the portal sagging like the ribs of a starved animal. Everyone in Leadville knew the McCready shaft. It was a failure, a hole in the ground that had produced nothing, and cost McCready his last dollar before he drank himself to death in the Chestnut Street saloon. But Britta had noticed something that no one else had reason to notice. On that cold October morning, as she walked past the collapsed entrance, she had seen steam, a thin, barely visible wisp of moisture rising from the rubble, dissolving into the frigid air. It was the breath of the earth, warm air from deep underground, meeting the cold surface and condensing. She had stopped and held her hand over the rubble. Warmth, faint but unmistakable. She had said nothing about it. Who would she tell? Who would listen to a Danish widow talking about the breath of warm air from a dead mine? Now, standing beside her possessions on the frozen street, that memory was the only door left open. She could not carry everything. She loaded the trunk and the toolbox onto a small handcart she borrowed, silently and without asking, from behind the livery stable. She placed Eric's instruments on top, then her father's journal, wrapped in oilcloth. The crate of books she left beside the boardwalk, knowing they would be scavenged before morning. She took one last look at the assay office, at the window where she had handed results to miners for 7 weeks, and then she turned and began walking. The McCready claim was 1.5 miles from town, up a switchback trail that climbed the eastern slope above California Gulch. By the time Britta reached it, the sun had dropped behind the peaks and the temperature was falling with a particular speed that November brings to 10,000 feet of elevation. Her hands were numb. Her face felt like carved wood. The collapsed entrance was exactly as she remembered it, a jumble of broken timber and granite rubble, overgrown with dead scrub, the kind of place a person walks past without a second glance. She set down the handcart and placed her bare palm against the rubble. Warmth. Not heat, but warmth. A steady, patient exhalation from somewhere deep inside the hill. She began to dig, not wildly, not desperately. She dug the way her father had taught her to dig, methodically, reading the rubble as she moved it. The collapse was not total. The portal timbers had buckled, but the shaft behind them, cut through solid granite, was likely intact. The rubble was loose, not cemented, and she could move it stone by stone. She worked by the light of a candle stub wedged into a crack, her breath coming in white bursts, her shoulders burning, the cold forgotten in the pure animal focus of labor. By midnight she had cleared an opening large enough to crawl through. She lit a second candle and held it inside. The flame burned steady and upright. Good air. She crawled in. The shaft was intact. It ran straight into the hillside for perhaps 40 feet. A rough tunnel 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, the walls raw granite, the floor covered in fine gravel and dust. And it was warm, not warm like a room with a fire, but warm like a root cellar in autumn, a steady, unchanging temperature that she estimated at perhaps 50 degrees. Outside it was already below zero. Britta sat on the floor of the dead mine and cried. She cried for exactly as long as it took the candle to burn down a 1/4 inch, and then she stopped and began to work. Over the following days she transformed the Macready shaft into something that Alderman Croft and Silas Blackwood and every miner in Leadville would have called impossible. The first problem was moisture. The shaft walls wept with condensation where the warm interior air met the cold rock near the entrance. Britta solved this the way her father's journal described solving the same problem in the Mariaga salt mines. She built a false wall. Using flat stones from the creek bed and clay she dug from a deposit she found 50 yards down the slope, she constructed a second wall 6 inches inside the entrance, leaving a gap between the stone and the granite. This gap acted as a buffer, a dead airspace that prevented the warm interior air from touching the cold outer rock. The condensation collected in the gap and drained out through a small channel she cut in the floor. The second problem was heat. 50 degrees was survivable but not comfortable. Here, her father's journal was explicit. In a diagram labeled Varnfordling, heat distribution, he had drawn a cross-section of a salt mine chamber with a small fire at one end and a series of stone walls arranged in a zigzag pattern. The principle was simple and ancient. You do not heat the air. Air is a thief. It takes your heat and carries it away through every crack and opening. Instead, you heat the stone. Stone is loyal. It absorbs heat slowly, holds it jealously, and releases it back with miserly patience. Britta built a firebox at the back of the shaft, a small chamber of stacked stone with a flue channel that she cut upward through a natural fissure in the granite. She did not know the English word for what she was building. Her father had called it a kakelovna, a thing of tiles and moss. The fire itself was small, no bigger than what you would use to brew coffee, but the smoke and hot air traveled through a winding channel of stacked stone before reaching the flue, and each stone in that channel absorbed heat like a sponge absorbs water. After 2 hours of a small fire, the stones were warm to the touch. After 4 hours, they were hot, and they stayed hot for 8 hours after the fire went out. She burned less wood in a day than the cabins in town burned in an hour. The third problem was air. A sealed space with a fire is a coffin. Britta used a principle so simple it embarrassed the engineering it replaced. The flue at the back drew air out. This created a gentle suction that pulled fresh air in through the entrance. But the entrance was also where the cold came in, so she built a baffle, a curved wall of stone just inside the entrance that forced the incoming air to travel along the warm inner wall before reaching the living space. By the time the fresh air reached her, it had been warmed by the thermal mass of the stone. The mine breathed. It inhaled cold air and exhaled it warm, a slow, constant respiration that required no bellows, no machinery, no effort. Just physics. Just the patient wisdom of stone and heat and gravity that her father had understood, and that the miners of Leadville with their roaring fireplaces and their 10-cord woodpiles had never needed to learn. By the second week of November, Britain's shelter was complete. The interior was dry, warm, and still. She had a sleeping platform of pine boughs laid over flat stones, raised off the floor to stay above the cool air that settled at ground level. She had a small work area where she set up Eric's beam scale and reagent kit, because even in exile she was an Arsair, and the work was who she was. She had a shelf of flat stones where she kept her food stores, the dried meat and flour she had bought with her $11, supplemented by the rabbit snares she set along the creek. She also had the owls. They had been there before her. A pair of great horned owls had been roosting in the upper reaches of the shaft, where a collapse had created a small chamber open to the sky. Britta discovered them on her third night, when their calls echoed down the tunnel, low and resonant, amplified by the stone walls into something that sounded almost human. The first time she heard it, her blood stopped. The sound traveled through the rock and arrived at her ears transformed. The owl's deep hoo stretched and softened by the acoustics of the shaft into something that sounded impossibly like a voice, like a woman's voice calling from far away. She knew it was the owls. She had seen them, their yellow eyes catching her candlelight, their massive silhouettes hunched on a timber brace near the ceiling collapse. But knowing did not stop the sound from reaching the part of her that was still raw, still listening for something it would never hear again. The owls called and the mine answered, and a space between the call and the echo, Britta heard her mother. She heard her mother's voice calling her in from the fields in Jutland, calling her name in Danish, the vowels long and rounded and warm. She let them stay. She named them. The larger one she called Fader, father. The smaller one, Mother. They watched her with their ancient, unblinking eyes, and she talked to them in Danish when the loneliness grew teeth. The town, meanwhile, was preparing for winter in the way it always did. More wood, thicker chinking, heavier blankets. Silas Blackwood, who owned the largest cabin in Leadville and served as an informal authority on all matters of construction, had spent the autumn reinforcing his walls and stockpiling 15 cords of firewood. He was a broad man with hands like shovels and a voice that carried the weight of a man accustomed to being right. He had heard about the widow. Everyone had heard. She went into the Macready shaft, the trapper, Dunnigan, told him one evening at the saloon, shaking his head. Saw smoke coming out of the hill. Thought it was a grass fire. Went up there, and she's living in it. Living in it like a badger. Blackwood had laughed, but it was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so absurd that the only response is amusement. That shaft is a death trap. The timbers are rotten. The first good freeze will crack that granite and bring the whole thing down on her head. She's digging her own grave and furnishing it. The mother, the Malbert song, Furado. Bang. Alderman Croft, who happened to be passing through again on his circuit, was less amused. He had stood on the boardwalk with Blackwood, watching the distant hillside where a thin thread of smoke rose from a place where no smoke should be. He adjusted his empty watch chain. I offered her Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite defensiveness, but lived in the same neighborhood. She chose not to take it. What Croft did not say, what he would not say until much later, was that he had gone to Calloway's himself after posting the notice. He'd asked about rates, about availability. Mrs. Calloway had looked at him over her spectacles and said, "I don't board women alone, Mr. Croft. It invites talk." He had stood on Calloway's porch for a long moment after that, looking at his boots, and then he had walked back to the cooperative office and filed his paperwork and told himself that the widow would find a way east. People always found a way. December came to Leadville like a sentence being carried out. The storms began on the 4th and did not stop. They came in waves, each one worse than the last. The temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there. The wind came down from the peaks with a sound like tearing canvas. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were buried. The road to the railhead became impassable on December 9th. Leadville was cut off. By the 3rd week, the wood piles were shrinking. Blackwood's 15 cords, which should have lasted until February, were disappearing at a rate that made him lie awake at night, calculating. The problem was simple. His cabin, like every cabin in Leadville, was built to fight the cold. Thick log walls, a massive stone fireplace, heavy chinking. But the logs conducted heat outward. The fireplace roared and the heat flew up the chimney. The chinking cracked in the freeze and the wind found every gap. They were burning wood as fast as they could cut it, and the cold was winning. The livestock began to die on December 18th. 2 of Morrison's horses froze in their stalls. The Hendersons lost all their chickens in a single night. Frostbite cases appeared at the doctor's office, fingers and toes turning the color of old tallow, and on the hillside above California Gulch, a thin wisp of smoke continued to rise from the earth, steady and unhurried, as if the hill itself were breathing. Blackwood went up on December 22nd. He told himself it was to recover a body. He told his wife he was checking on the poor widow. He brought a blanket and a flask of whiskey, the provisions of a man expecting to find a corpse. He found the entrance cleared, the path neatly packed, a small windbreak of stackstone sheltering the opening from the prevailing wind. He ducked inside. The warmth hit him like a physical thing. He stood in the entrance passage, his mouth open, his body suddenly aware of how cold it had been. The air was still, dry and warm. Not hot, but warm in a way that his own cabin, with its roaring fireplace and its 15 cords of wood, had not been warm in weeks. He walked forward, past the curb baffle wall and into the main chamber. Brisha was sitting at her work table, a candle burning, Eric's beam scale before her. She was weighing something, a small sample of crucite she had found in the rubble of the shaft. She looked up at Blackwood with the calm expression of a person who has been expecting a visitor, but is in no hurry to greet one. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. He stood there, this large, capable man, and he could not speak. The chamber was warm. The walls radiated heat he could feel on his face. An owl shifted on a timber above him, its feathers ruffling with a sound like shuffled paper. The air smelled of pine resin and warm stone and candle wax. "How?" he said. It was not a question. It was a surrender. Britta set down her tweezers. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has just walked a very long distance to arrive at a place you have been waiting. "You build walls to keep the cold out," she said. "My father built walls to keep the warmth in." "It is not the same thing." Blackwood put his bare hand on the clay-lined wall. It was warm. Warm like a living thing, warm like the flank of a horse, warm in a way that stone should not be warm in December at 10,000 feet with the worst winter in living memory howling outside. He sat down on the floor of the mine and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "My daughter has frostbite on 3 fingers," he said. "The doctor says he may have to take one." Bruckner was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and walked to the shelf where she kept her father's journal. She opened it to the page with the Van Fordling diagram, the heat distribution drawing that had saved her life. She held it out to him. "Bring her here tonight," Britton said. "Bring your wife. The warmth will help the circulation. And tomorrow, I will show you how to build this in your own home." He took the journal with both hands, the way you take something sacred. The next morning, Blackwood returned with rope, tools, and 3 other men. Their skepticism lasted exactly as long as it took them to step inside. Britta showed them everything: the false wall, the firebox, The winding few channel, the thermal mass, the baffle. She explained each principle patiently, using the words her father had used, translating from Danish when English failed her. "The stone is a bank," she said, pointing to the heated wall. "You put heat in, the stone saves it. You take heat out slowly, all night, all day. The stone does not spend what it does not have." Blackwood understood immediately. He was a builder, and what Britain was showing him was not magic. It was architecture. It was physics. It was the accumulated knowledge of men who had lived inside the earth for centuries. Knowledge that the American frontier, with its obsession with speed and timber and brute force, had never thought to ask about. Within a week, Blackwood had retrofitted his own cabin. He packed earth against the north wall 3 feet thick. He rebuilt his fireplace as a masonry heater, a massive structure of brick and stone with a winding internal flue that absorbed heat before it could escape up the chimney. He sealed his cabin not with chinking, but with a clay and straw mixture that Britain mixed for him, following a recipe from her father's journal. His wood consumption dropped by 2/3. His cabin was warmer than it had ever been. The other families came next: Morrison, Henderson, the Quinns, even old Dunnigan the trapper, who said he did not trust any shelter he could not pack on a mule, but who stood inside Britain's mine with his hat in his hands and his mouth open like a man who has just seen a card trick he cannot explain. Alderman Croft came last. He arrived on a Tuesday in January, his leather valise tucked under his arm, his empty watch chain glinting in the pale winter sun. He stood at the entrance to the mine for a long time before ducking inside. When he emerged, 20 minutes later, he walked directly to Blackwood's cabin and said, without preamble, "I will write to the Territorial Board about an accelerated examination for Mrs. Carstensen. She should not have to wait until March." Blackwood looked at him. She should not have had to wait at all. Croft adjusted his watch chain. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he nodded once sharply and walked back down the hill toward town. Leadville survives that winter. Other camps did not. Kokomo lost 4 residents to exposure. Robinson was abandoned entirely in February, its residents straggling into Leadville with frostbitten faces and stories of cabins buried to the roof lines. They found a town that was cold but functioning. A town that had learned in the space of 6 weeks a way of building that turned the earth itself into a furnace. When the spring thaw came in April, the trail to the McCready shaft was worn smooth by hundreds of boots. Britta Carstensen stood at the entrance of her mine, her father's journal open on her work table, teaching a group of miners' wives how to mix the clay and straw insulation. The owls had left for the season, gone to hunt the open meadows above timberline. The mine was quiet without them. Sometimes in the evenings when the last student had gone and the mine was still, Britta would sit at Eric's beam scale and weigh nothing. She would adjust the weights, calibrate the balance, feel the familiar brass under her fingers. She would open her father's journal to a random page and read a passage aloud in Danish, her voice echoing softly off the warm stone walls, and occasionally, just occasionally, an echo would come back to her from deep in the shaft, a resonance in the rock that sounded almost like an answer. She knew it was acoustics. She knew it was stone. She listened anyway. The story of Britta Carstensen is not just a story about a mine or a method. It is a story about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between building against something and building with it. We spend our lives adding more wood to the fire. More hours, more effort, more force. We build our walls thicker and burn our resources faster, and we are somehow surprised when the cold still finds us, when the winter still wins. What about you? What collapsed entrance have you been walking past on your way to the creek, ignoring the warmth rising from the rubble because someone told you it was a dead end? What journal is sitting in your trunk, untranslated, unread, written in a language you have almost forgotten? What voice is echoing back to you from the deep places, and why have you stopped listening? The earth remembers summer, 20 feet down, beneath the frost and the frozen mud and the world's indifference, the temperature does not change. The warmth is already there. It has always been there. Your mind is waiting. Your journal is waiting. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival and shelter. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.